it's these points in times where it's like, I'm ready to get going, ready to start this thing up. And that's when all of the alerts want to go off. That's when my glasses want to fall off my head and then get smudged. And it makes it really hard to read when you can't see what's going on. And then, that doesn't add insult to injury. I have got a cat who insists that my lap is the place to be right now. So, if you hear a little purr box going on, I do apologize, but that is exactly what you're listening to. So, all of that aside, we are going to get started with today's little thing. Let's get something. You have to let me know if that's a little too loud or not. I can just barely hear it, so I think that's good. Let's change that screen. We're going to put it over here on the Just Chatting screen. There we go. Nice little lovely background music. So today is by popular demand. People just wanted something nice and quiet and chill to listen to. And so one of the suggestions was just sit down and read a book. So I thought we would read from one of my personal favorite books. Hi, Squirrel. Welcome on in. Yeah, so in case anybody's... Oh, all right. That's... Like, I thought I turned everything off. All right. Well, I'm glad it happened now while we're talking about it than later on. While we're actually into what we were doing. Let's go find him. There. Let's just turn that off. Okay. See, we're finding all the things. No, you're fine. It's perfectly fine. So we are going to dive right on in. We're going to read from Douglas Adams, a favorite author of mine, one of many favorite authors, but it happened to be the book I had on hand. My father-in-law actually got this for me for a Christmas present one year. So it's a hardbound Douglas Adams with the full story. Hello, welcome on in, Joker. So I've got all the sounds turned off, all the alerts turned off, all the everything. This is really just going to be one of those streams that you can put in the background and just listen to. Hopefully, if you're falling asleep, it'll help you fall asleep. If you're not, maybe you're just interested in listening to the story. But it is definitely going to be a very quiet, calm stream. And so if you're looking for video gameplay or anything else of that nature, this is probably not going to be the place. But if you're just listening for, you want to hear a good story, then buckle up as we are going to get started with this one. So we are going to read from the Ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We are going to start at the very first book. We're going to try this out. If everybody likes it well enough, we might make this a regular thing. If not, then, hey, you got at least a partial story out of this one today. So let's get started, as all books do, at the very beginning. And we're just going to dive right on in. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 98 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think that digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much most of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd on the whole because it wasn't really the small green pieces of paper's fault that they were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place. And some said even the trees had been a bad move, and that no one should have ever left the ocean. And then one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth suddenly realized what had been wrong all this time. She finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right. It would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to the phone to tell anyone about it, a terrible, stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story, but it is the story of that terrible, stupid catastrophe and some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not an Earth book, never published on Earth, and until the terrible catastrophe ever occurred, never seen or even heard by any Earthman. Nevertheless, a wholly remarkable book. In fact, it was probably the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had ever heard of either. The bulldozer outside the... Ooh, we skipped way ahead. I love when the pages stick together. Not only is it a wholly unremarkable book, it is also a highly successful one. More popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 53 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Ulan Kolvid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters. Where God Went Wrong, some more of God's greatest mistakes, and who is this God person anyways? In many ways, in many of the more relaxed civilizations on the outer eastern rim of the galaxy, the Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplemented the Great Encyclopedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom. For though it has many omissions and contains much that is apocryphal, or at least wildly inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and second, it has the words "Don't Panic" inscribed in large friendly letters on the cover. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how these consequences are inextricably intertwined with this remarkable book begins very simply. It begins with a house. The house stood on a slight rise on the edge of the village. It stood on its own and looked out over a broad spread of West Country farmland. Not a remarkable house by any means. It was 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of bricks, and had 4 windows set in the front of a size and proportion which were more or less exactly failed to please the eyes. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent. And that was only because it happened to be the one he lived in. He had lived in it for about 3 years, and ever since he had moved out of London because it made him nervous and irritable, he was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was looking so worried about. He worked in a local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought. It was to most of his friends working in advertisement. On Wednesday night, it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, but the Thursday morning sun was bright and clear as it shone on Arthur Dent's house for what was to be the last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur that the council wanted to knock down his house and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered blearily around his room, opened the window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers, and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, so scrub. Shaving mirror pointed at the ceiling. He adjusted it. For a moment, it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted it, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried, and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee. Yawn. Oh. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect it with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water, and then another. He began to suspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Oh, right, he had been drinking the night before. He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off to the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pub, he thought. Oh, dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry about something that seemed important. He'd been telling people about it at great lengths. He rather suspected his clearest visual recollection was of a glazed look on the other people's face. Something about a new bypass he'd just found out about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known about it. Ridiculous. He took a big swig of water. It would sort itself out, he decided. No one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would definitely sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover. It had earned him, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow, he thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something to connect it with. 15 seconds later, he was out of the house and lying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Mr. L. Prosser was, as they say, only human. In other words, he was a carbon-based bipedal life form descended from an ape. More specifically, he was 40, fat, and shabby, and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, though, he didn't know it, he was a direct male descendant of Genghis Khan. Though intervening generations and racial mixing has so juggled his genes that he had no discernible Mongoloid features. And the only vestiges left in Mr. L. Prosser of his mighty ancestry was a pronounced stoutness and the tum and predilection for little fur hats. He was by no means a great warrior. In fact, he was nervous, worried little man. Today, he was in particularly nervous and worried because something had gone seriously wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur Dent's house got cleared out of the way before the day was out. "Come off it, Mr. Dent," he said. "You can't win and you know it. You can't lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely." He tried to make his eyes blaze fiercely, but they just wouldn't do it. Arthur laid in the mud and squelched at him. "I'm game," he said. "We'll see who rusts first." "I'm afraid you're just going to have to accept it," said Mr. Prosser, gripping his fur hat and rolling it around the top of his head. "This bypass has to be built, and it's going to be built." "First I've heard of it," said Arthur. "Why has it got to be built?" Mr. Prosser shook his fingers at him for a bit, then stomped, put it away again. "What do you mean, why's it got to be built?" he said. "It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses." Bypasses are devices that allow people to dash from point A to point B very fast, while other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly in between, are often given to wonder what's so great about point A that so many people from point B are so keen to get there, and what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are keen to get there. They often wish that people would just for once work it all out where the hell they wanted to be. Mr. Prosser wanted to be at point D. Point D wasn't anywhere in particular. It was just any convenient point, a very long way from point A, B, and C. He would have a nice little cottage at point D with axes over the door and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the nearest pub to point D. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted axes. He didn't know why. He just liked axes. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, but it was equally uncomfortable on each. Obviously, somebody had been appallingly incompetent, and he had hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Prosser said, "You were quite entitled to make any suggestions or protest at the appropriate time, you know." "Appropriate time?" hooted Arthur. "Appropriate time? The first I knew about it was when the workman arrived at my home yesterday. I asked him if he'd come to clean the windows, and he said no. He'd come to demolish the house. He didn't tell me straight away, of course. Oh, no. First, he wiped a couple of windows and charged me $5. Then he told me. But, Mr. Dent, the plans have been available in the local planning office for the last 9 months. Oh, yes. Well, as soon as I heard, I went straight around to see them. Yesterday afternoon, you hadn't exactly gone out of your way to call attention to them, had you? I mean, like actually telling anybody or anything?" "But the plans were on display." "On display? I eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them." "Well, that's the display department." "With a flashlight." "Ah, well, the lights had probably gone out." "So had the stairs." "But look, you found the notice, didn't you?" "Yes," said Arthur. "Yes, I did. It was on display in the bottom of a locked file cabinet stuck in a disused lavatory with a sign on the door saying, 'Beware of leopard.'" A cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent as he lay there propped up on his elbows in the cold mud. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Prosser frowned. "It's not like it's a particularly nice house," he said. "I'm sorry, but I happen to like it." "You'll like the bypass." "Oh, shut up," said Arthur Dent. "Shut up and go away, and take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got the leg to stand on, and you know it." Mr. Prosser's mouth opened and closed a couple of times, while his mind was, for a moment, filled with the inexplicable but terribly attractive visions of Arthur Dent's house being consumed with fire, and Arthur himself running screaming from the blazing ruin, with at least 3 hefty spears protruding from his back. Mr. Prosser was often bothered with visions like these, and they made him feel very nervous. He stuttered for a moment and then pulled himself together. "Mr. Dent," he said. "Hello, yes," said Arthur. "Some factual information for you. Have you any idea how much damage that bulldozer would suffer if I just let it roll straight over you?" "How much?" said Arthur. "Absolutely none at all," said Mr. Prosser, and stormed nervously off, wondering why his brain was filled with 1,000 hairy horsemen all shouting at him. Welcome on in, Stuff It Boo. By a curious coincidence, none at all, is exactly how much suspicion that the ape descendant Arthur Dent had that one of his closest friends was not descended from an ape, but was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and not from the Guildford as he so usually claimed. Arthur Dent had never ever suspected this. This friend of his had arrived on the planet Earth some 15 years previously, and he had worked hard to blend himself into Earth society with, it must be said, some success. For instance, he had spent those 15 years pretending to be an out-of-work actor, which was plausible enough. He had made one careless blunder, though. Because he had skipped a bit on his preparatory research, the information he had gathered had led him to choose the name Ford Prefect as being a nicely inconspicuous name. He was not conspicuously tall. His features were striking, but not conspicuously handsome. His hair was wiry and gingerish and brushed backwards from the temple. His skin seemed to be pulled backwards from the nose. There was something rather slightly odd about him, but it was difficult to say what it was. Perhaps it was the way that his eyes didn't seem to blink often enough, and when you talked to him for any length of time, your eyes began to involuntarily water on his behalf. Perhaps it was he smiled slightly too broadly and gave people the unnerving impression that he was about to go for their neck. He struck most of the friends he had made on Earth as eccentric, but a harmless one, an unruly boozer who, with some oddish habits. For instance, he would often gatecrash university parties, get badly drunk, and start making fun of any astrophysicist he could find, till he got thrown out. Sometimes he would get seized with the oddly distracted moods and stare into the sky as if hypnotized until somebody asked him what he was doing. Then he would start guiltily and for a moment relax and just grin. "I was just looking for flying saucers," he would joke. And everyone would laugh and ask him what sort of flying saucers he would look for. "Green ones," he would reply with a wicked grin, laugh wildly for a moment, and then suddenly lunge for the nearest bar and buy an enormous round of drinks. Evenings like this usually ended badly. Ford would get out of his skull on whiskey, huddled in a corner with some girl, and explain to her in slurred phrases that honestly the color of the flying saucer didn't really matter that much. Thereafter, staggering, semi-paralytic, down the night streets, he would often ask passing policemen if they knew the way to Betelgeuse. The policeman would usually say something like, "Don't you think it's about time you went off home, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby. I'm trying to," is what Ford would invariably reply on these occasions. In fact, what he was really looking for when he stared distractedly into the sky was any kind of flying saucer at all. The reason he said green was that green was traditionally the space livery of the Betelgeuse trading scouts. Ford Prefect was desperate that any flying saucer at all would arrive. Because 15 years was a long time to get stranded anywhere, particularly somewhere as mind-bogglingly dull as Earth. Ford wished that a flying saucer would arrive soon because he knew how to flag a flying saucer down and get lists from them. He knew how to see the marvels of the universe for less than $30 Altarian a day. In fact, Ford Prefect was a roving researcher for that wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Human beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime, life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled into a steady routine. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching in the mud, making occasional demands to see his lawyer, his mother, or a good book. It was Mr. Prosser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with the occasional new ploys, such as For the Public Good talk or the March of Progress talk. They knocked my house down once, never looked back talk, and various other cajoles and or threats. And it was the bull driver's accepted role to sit around drinking coffee, experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial advantage. The earth moved slowly in its diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out the mud that Arthur lay in. A shadow moved across him again. "Hello, Arthur," said the shadow. Arthur looked up and squinted into the sun and was startled to see Ford Prefect standing above him. "Ford." "Hello, how are you?" "Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Well, I've just got all these bulldozers and things to lie in front of because they'll knock down my house if I don't. But other than that, well, no, not especially. Why?" They don't do or have sarcasm on Beetlejuice, and Ford Prefect often failed to notice it unless he was concentrating. He said, "Good. Is there anywhere we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur. For a few seconds, Ford seemed to ignore him and finally stared fixedly into the sky like a rabbit trying to get away from or trying to get run over by a car. Then suddenly squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said urgently. "Fine," said Arthur. "Talk." "And drink," said Ford. "It's vitally important that we talk and drink. Now, we'll go to the pub in the village." He looked into the sky again, nervous, expectant. "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed at Prosser. "That man wants to knock down my house." Ford glanced at him, puzzled. "Well, he can do it while why can't he?" he asked. "But I don't want him to." "Ah." "Look, what's the matter with you, Ford?" said Arthur. "Nothing. Nothing's the matter. Listen to me. I've got to tell you the most important thing that you've ever heard. I've got to tell you now, and I've got to tell you at the saloon bar of the Horse and Groom." "But why?" "Because you're going to need a very, very stiff drink." Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find his will beginning to weaken. He didn't realize that this was because of an old drinking game that Ford learned to play in hyperspace ports that served the Mandranite mining belts in the star system of Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth game called Indian Wrestling, and was played like this. Two contestants would sit on either side of a table with a glass in front of each one of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of jank spirit. As immortalized in that old ancient Orion mining song, "Oh, don't give me none more of that old jank spirit. No, don't you give me none of that old jank spirit. For my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that sinful old jank spirit?" Each of the two contestants would then concentrate their will on the bottle and attempt to tip it and pour spirits into the glass of their opponent, who would then have to drink it. The bottle would then be refilled. The game would be played again and again. Once you started to lose, you probably would keep losing, because one of the effects of jank spirit is to depress telepsychic power. And as soon as a predetermined quantity had been consumed, the final loser would have to perform a forfeit, which was usually obscenely biological. Ford Prefect usually played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the Horse and Groom after all. "But what about my house?" he said plaintively. Ford looked across to Mr. Prosser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. "He wants to knock down your house." "Yes, He wants to build, and he can't because you're lying in front of his bulldozer. Yes, and I'm sure we can come to some arrangement, said Ford. Excuse me, he shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with the spokesman for the bulldozer drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard and how much they should get paid if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to see that Arthur had company. Yes, hello, he said. Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet? Can we, for the moment, said Ford, assume that he hasn't? Well, said Mr. Prosser, and can we also assume, said Ford, that he's going to stay here all day? So all of your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing. Could be. Well, if you're resigned to do that anyways, you don't actually need him to lie here all the time, do you? What? You don't, said Ford patiently, actually need him here. Mr. Prosser thought about this. Well, no, not as such, he said. Not exactly need. Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. Ford said, so, if you would just like to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could dip off down to the pub for half an hour. How does that sound? Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly sporty. Well, that sounds perfectly reasonable, he said in a reassuring tone of voice, wondering who he was trying to reassure. And if you wanted to pop off for a quick one yourself later, Ford said, we could always cover for you in return. Easy peasy. Well, thank you very much, said Mr. Prosser, who no longer knew how to play this at all. Thank you very much. Yes, it's very kind. He frowned, then smiled, and tried to do both at once. Failed, grasped hold of his fur hat, and rolled it fitfully around his head. He could only assume that he had just won. So, continued Ford Prefect, if you would just like to come over here and lie down. What? Said Mr. Prosser. I'm sorry. Perhaps I hadn't made myself fully clear. Somebody's got to lie here in front of the bulldozers, haven't they? Or there just wouldn't be anything to stop them from driving over Mr. Dent's house now, would there? What? Said Prosser again. It's very simple, said Ford. My client, Mr. Dent, said he will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come over here and take over for him. What are you talking about? Said Arthur. But Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. You want me, said Prosser, spelling out this new thought to himself, to come and lie here. Yes. In front of the bulldozer. Yes. Instead of Mr. Dent. Yes. In the mud. In, as you say, the mud. As soon as Mr. Prosser realized that he was substantially the loser, after all, it was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. This was more like the world he knew, and he sighed. In return, you will take Mr. Dent with you down to the pub. That's it, said Ford. That's it exactly. Mr. Prosser took a few nervous steps forward and stopped. Promise? He said. Promise, said Ford. He turned to Arthur. Come on now, he said. Get up and let the man lay down. Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Prosser, who sadly, awkwardly, sat down in the mud. He felt that his whole life was about some kind of dream, and he sometimes wondered whose it was and whether they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself around his bottom and his arms and oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely. And no sneaky knocking down Mr. Dent's house while he's away, all right? The mere thought, said Mr. Prosser, hadn't even begun to speculate. He continued to settle himself back about the merest possibility of crossing my mind. He saw the bulldozer union representative approaching and let his head sink and closed his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving he did know and had not constituted a mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noises, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened when he felt miserable or put upon, and he'd never been able to explain it to himself. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, the mighty Genghis Khan bellowed with rage. Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids, bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in mud, indecipherable strangers hanging out, inexplicably humiliation, an unidentifiable army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day. What a day. Ford Prefect knew that it didn't matter a pair of dingo's kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down now or not now. Arthur remained very worried. "But can we trust him?" he said. "Myself, I'd trust him to the end of the earth," said Ford. "Oh, yes," said Arthur. "And how far is that?" About 12 minutes away," said Ford. "Come on, I need a drink." We're going to pause right there because that is the end of chapter 1. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it this far. And I need something to wet my whistle just a little bit. Hello, Wars. Welcome on in. Welcome on in. Hello, Stuff It Boo. I am glad you are enjoying it. This was an asked thing to have happen, and so that's what we're doing right now. All right, and if we're all ready, can I get you to read to me while I work all the time? I think I might just put this as a point and redeem on the channel, and if people redeem it, then we'll come back here and we'll do some more book readings. We'll see. All right. Chapter 2. Here's what the Encyclopedia Galactica has to say about alcohol. It says that alcohol is a colorless, volatile liquid formed by the fermentation of sugars, and also notes its intoxicating effect on certain carbon-based life forms. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy also mentions alcohol. It says that the best drinks in existence is the Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster. It says that the effects of drinking a Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster is like having your brain smashed out by a slice of lemon wrapped around a large gold brick. The guide also tells you that on which planets the best Pan-Galactic Gargle Blasters are mixed, how much you can expect to pay for one, and what voluntary organization exists to help you rehabilitate afterwards. The guide even tells you how you can mix one yourself. Take the juice from one bottle of Old Jank Spirit, it says. Pour into it 1 measure of water from the seas of Santraginus 5. Oh, Santraginian seawater, it says. Oh, those Santraginian fish. Allow 3 cubes of Arcturian Megagin to melt into the mixture. It must be properly iced or the benzine is lost. Allow 4 liters of the Thalian marsh gas to bubble through it in memory of all those happy hikers who have died of pleasure in the marshes of Philea. Over the back of a silver spoon float a measure of Qualican hypermint extract, redolent of all the heady odors of the dark Qualitan zones, subtle, sweet, and mystic. Drop in the tooth of an Angolian sun tiger, watch it dissolve, spreading the fires of the Angolian suns deep into the heart of the drink. Sprinkle Zamphor, add an olive, drink. But very, very carefully. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sells rather better than the Encyclopedia Galactica. 6 pints of bitters, said Ford Prefect to the barman of the Horse and Groom. And quickly, please. The world's about to end. Barman of the Horse and Groom didn't deserve this sort of treatment. He was a dignified old man. He pushed his glasses up his nose and blinked at Ford Prefect. Ford ignored him and stared out the window to the barman, looking instead at Arthur, who shrugged helplessly and said nothing. So the barman said, "Oh yeah, sir, nice weather for you," and started pulling pints. He tried again. "Going to watch the match this afternoon, then?" Ford glanced at him. No point," he said, and looked back out the window. What's that? Foregone conclusion, then, you reckon, sir?" said the barman. "Arsenal without a chance." No, said Ford. "It's just that the world's about to end." "Oh, yes, sir. You said so," said the barman, looking over his glasses at this time at Arthur. "Lucky escape for Arsenal, then, if you did." Ford looked back at him, genuinely surprised. "No, not really," he said. He frowned. Barman breathed in heavily. "Well, there you are, sir. 6 points," he said. Arthur smiled at him wanly, shrugged again, and turned and smiled wanly at the rest of the pub, just in case any of them had heard what was going on. None of them had, and none of them would, or even could, understand what he was smiling at them for. A man sitting next to Ford at the bar looked at the two men, looked at the 6 pints, did a swift burst of mental arithmetic, arrived at an answer he liked, and grinned stupid, hopeful grin at them. "Get off," said Ford. "They're ours," giving him a look that would have made an Angolan sun tiger get on with what it was doing. Ford slapped a 5-pound note on the bar. He said, "Keep the change." "What? From a fiver? Thank you, sir." "Yeah, you've got about 10 minutes left to spend it." The barman decided to walk away for a bit. "Ford," said Arthur, "would you please tell me what the hell is going on?" "Drink up," said Ford. "You got 3 pints to get enough." 3 pints, said Arthur, "at lunchtime." The man next to Ford grinned and nodded happily. Ford ignored him. He said, "Time is an illusion. Lunchtime doubly so." "Very deep," said Arthur. "You should send that in to the Reader's Digest. They've got a page for people like you." "Drink up." "Why 3 pints all of a sudden?" "Muscle relaxant. You'll need it." "Muscle relaxant?" "Muscle relaxant." Arthur stared into his beer. "Did I do something wrong today?" he said. "Or has the whole world always been like this? I've been too wrapped up in myself to notice." "All right," said Ford. "I'll try my best to explain. How long have we known each other?" How long? Arthur thought. I don't know. 4, 5, 6 years, maybe? Most of it seemed to make some kind of sense at some point in time. "All right," said Ford. "How would you react if I said that I'm not from Guildford after all, but from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Beetlejuice?" Arthur shrugged in a so-so way. "I don't know," he said, taking a pull of beer. Why do you think that would be something? Why do you think? Is that something you're likely to say?" Ford just gave up. It really wasn't worth bothering at the moment. What with the world about to end, he just said, "Drink up." He added perfectly, factually, "The world is about to end." Arthur gave the rest of the pub another wan smile. The rest of the pub frowned at him. A man waved at him to stop smiling at them and mind his own business. "This must be Thursday," said Arthur to himself, sinking low over his beer. "I never could get the hang of Thursday." I love these short chapters. Let's see. How are we doing? Oh, that's not too bad. All right. Chapter 3. On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the ionosphere. Many miles above the surface of the planet, several somethings, in fact. Several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab-like somethings, huge as office blocks, silent as birds. They soared with ease, basking in electromagnetic rays from the star's soul, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious of their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow something went unnoticed at Goondhilly. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip. Woomera and Jodrell Bank looked straight through them. This was a pity because it was exactly the sort of thing that they had been looking for all these years. The only place that they registered at all was a small black device called a sub-ether sensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness inside of a leather satchel, which Ford Prefect habitually wore slung around his neck. The contents of Ford Prefect's satchel were quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth's physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which was why he was always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-eared scripts for plays he pretended he was auditioning for stuffed in the top. Besides the sub-ether sensomatic and the scripts he had an electronic thumb, a sort of short, squat black rod, smooth and matted, with a couple of flat switches and a dial at one end. He also had a device that looked rather like a largest electronic calculator. It's had about 100 tiny flat buttons and a screen about 4 inches square on which any one of the million pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this was one of the reasons why the snug plastic cover it fitted into had the words "Don't Panic" printed in large, friendly letters. The other reason was that this device was, in fact, the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason why it was published in the form of a micro-submeson electronic component is that if it were printed in normal book forms, an interstellar hitchhiker would require several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around in. To work on remembering those. I didn't get all of the alerts. Sorry. Beneath that, in Ford Prefect's satchel, were a few ballpoint pens, a notepad, and a largest bath towel from Marks and Spencer's. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly, it has a great practical value. You can wrap it around your arm for warmth as you bound around the cold moons of Jagulan Beta. You can lie on it in the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of Saturnus V. Inhaling the heady sea vapors, you can sleep under it beneath the stars which shine so sadly and redly on the desert world of Kakafrun. Use it to sail a mini raft down the slow, heavy river of Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it around your head to ward off noxious fumes or avoid the gaze of the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Trow. A truly mind-boggling, stupid animal. It assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. Daft as a brush, but very, very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal. And of course, dry yourself off with it. It still seems to be clean enough. More importantly, a towel has immense psychological value. For some reason, if a strag, non-hitchhiker, discovers that a hitchhiker has his towel with him, he will automatically assume that he is also in the possession of a toothbrush, a washcloth, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, map, ball of string, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc., etc. Furthermore, the strag will then happily lend the hitchhiker any of those or a dozen other items that the hitchhiker might accidentally have lost. What the strag will think is that any man who can hitchhike the length and breadth of the galaxy, roughing it, slumming it, struggling against terrible odds, winning through, and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence a phrase that has been passed into hitchhiker slang as in, "Hey, you sass, that hoopy Ford prefect, there's a Frood who really knows where his towel is." Sass. Know, be aware of, meet, have sex with, hoopy, really together guy, and Frood, a really amazing together guy. Nesting quietly on top of the towel in Ford Prefect's satchel, the sub-ether sensomatic began to wink more quickly. Miles above the surface of the planet, the huge yellow something began to fan out. At Jodron's bank, someone decided it was time for a nice, relaxing cup of tea. "You got a towel with you?" said Ford suddenly to Arthur. Arthur struggled through his third pint, looked at him. "Why?" "What? No. Should I?" He gave up at being surprised. There didn't seem to be any point any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. "Drink up," he said. At that moment, the dull sound of a rumbling crash from outside filtered through the low murmur of the pub. Through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford hiccuping over the whiskey Ford had eventually bought him. Arthur choked on his beer, leapt to his feet. "What's this?" he yelled. "Don't worry," said Ford. "They haven't started yet." "Thank God for that," said Arthur, and relaxed. "It's probably just your house being knocked down," said Ford, downing his last pipe. "What?" shouted Arthur. Suddenly, Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly around at him and ran to the window. "My gods! They're knocking my house down. What the hell am I doing in the pub with Ford?" "It hardly makes any difference at this stage," said Ford. "Let them have their fun." "Fun?" yelped Arthur. "Fun?" Quickly checked out the window again and to see that they were talking about the same thing. "Damn their fun," he hooted, and ran out the pub, furiously waving a nearly empty glass of beer. He made no friends at all in the pub at lunchtime. "Stop, you vandals! You homewreckers!" bawled Arthur. "You half-crazed Visigoths! Stop, will you?" Ford would have to go after him. Turning quickly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. "There you are, sir," said the barman, slapping the packets on the table. 28 pence, if you be so kind." Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another 5-pound note, told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it, and then looked at Ford. He suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand, because no one on Earth had ever experienced it before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny subliminal signal. That signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that being is from the place of his birth. On Earth, it's never been possible to be farther than 16,000 miles from your birthplace. which really isn't that far. So such signals are too minimal, too minute to be noticed. Ford Prefect was at this moment under great stress, and he was born 600 light years away in the area near the vicinity of Betelgeuse. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Prefect with a new sense of respect, almost awe. "Are you serious, sir?" he said in a small whisper, which had the effect of silencing the pup. "You really think the world's going to come to an end?" "Yes," said Ford. "But this afternoon?" Ford had recovered himself. He was at his flippiest. "Yes," he said gaily. "In less than 2 minutes, I would estimate." The barman couldn't believe that this conversation he was having, and he couldn't believe the sensation that he just had. Isn't there anything we can do about it then?" "Yeah," he said. "No, nothing," said Ford, stuffing the peanuts into his pockets. Someone in a hushed bar suddenly laughed raucously at how stupid everyone had become. The man sitting next to Ford was a bit sozzled by now. His eyes weaved their way up to Ford. "I thought," he said, "if the world was going to end, it would have been to me that we were meant to lie down or put a paper bag over our head or something." "If you like, yeah," said Ford. "Well, that's what they told us to do in the army," said the man. His eyes began the long trek back towards his whiskey. "Will that help, sir?" said the barman. "No," said Ford, and gave him a friendly smile. "Excuse me," he said. "I've got to go." With a wave, he left. And more alerts I got to work on. Welcome on in, Raiders. We are enjoying ourselves a cozy little read, a very chill little stream. Pull up a chair and sit on down. The pub was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassingly enough, the man with the raucous laugh did it again. The girl he had dragged along to the pub with him had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour, and it would probably have been a great satisfaction to her to know that in a minute and a half or so, give or take, he would suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when that moment came, she would be too busy evaporating herself to notice. The barman cleared his throat. He heard himself say, "Last orders, please." The huge yellow machines began to sink downwards, to move faster. Ford knew they were there. This wasn't the way he wanted it. Yes, we are on Chapter 3 of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become. He didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice the sudden irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozer crawling over the rubble that had been his home. "You barbarians!" he yelled. "I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I'll have you hung, drawn, and quartered, and whipped, and boiled, until you've had enough." Ford was running after him very, very fast. "And then I will do it again," yelled Ford. "And when I've finished, I will take it all into little bits, and I will jump up and down on you." Arthur didn't notice that the men were running from the bulldozer. He didn't notice that Mr. Prosser was staring hectically into the sky. What Mr. Prosser had noticed was that huge yellow something. And they were screaming through the clouds, impossibly huge yellow somethings. "And I will carry on jumping on them," yelled Arthur, still running, "until I get blisters, or I can think of something even more unpleasant to do." And then Arthur tripped and fell headlong, rolled, and landed flat on his back. At last, he noticed that something was going on. His fingers shot upwards. "What the hell is that?" he shrieked. Whatever it was raced across the sky in a monstrous yellowness, tore the sky apart with mind-boggling noise, and leapt off into the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut behind it in a bang that drove your ears 6 feet into your skull. Another one followed and did the same exact thing, only louder. It's difficult to say exactly what the people on the surface of the planet were doing now, because they didn't really know what they were doing themselves. None of it made a lot of sense. Running into houses, running out of houses, howling noiselessly at the noise. All around the world, city streets exploded with people, cars getting into each other as the noise fell on them, and then rolled off like tidal waves over hills and valleys, deserts and oceans, seemed to flatten everything it hit. Only one man stood and watched the sky, stood with the terrible sadness in his eyes and the rubber bungs in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening, and had known ever since his sub-etha sensomatic had started winking in the dead of the night beside his pillow and waken him with a start. It was what he had waited all these years. But when he had deciphered the signal pattern sitting alone in his small dark room, a coldness gripped him, squeezed his hearts. Of all the races in the galaxy who could have come and said a big hello to planet Earth, he thought, didn't it just have to be the Vogons? Still, he knew what he had to do. As the Vogon's crafts screamed through the air high above him, he opened his satchel, threw away a copy of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. He threw away a copy of Godspell. He wouldn't need them where he was going. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. And he knew where his towel was. A sudden silence hit the earth. If anything, it was worse than the noise. For a while, nothing happened. The great ships hung motionless in the sky. Over every nation on the earth, motionless they hung. Huge, heavy, steady in the sky. A blasphemy against nature. Many of the people went straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. The ships hung in the sky much the same way that bricks don't. And still, nothing happened. Then there was a slight whisper, a sudden, spacious whisper of open ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, every television, every cassette recorder, every woofer, every tweeter, every mid-range driver in the world quietly turned on. Every tin can, every dustbin, every window, every car, every wine glass, every sheet of rusty metal became activated as an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the earth passed away, it was going to be treated to the very ultimate in sound reproduction, the greatest public address system ever built. But there was no concert, no music, no fanfare, just a simple message. People of Earth, your attention, please, a voice said. It was a wonderful, perfect quadraphonic sound, with distortion levels so low as to make a brave man weep. This is the prosthetic Vogon Jeltz of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council, the voice continued. As you will have no doubt be aware, the plans for development of the outlying regions of the galaxies require the building of a hyperspace express route through your star system, and regrettably, your planet is one of those scheduled for demolition. The process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth minutes. Thank you. The PA died away. The uncomprehending terror settled on the watching people of Earth. The terror moved slowly through the gathered crowds as if they were iron filings on a sheet of board, and a magnet was moving beneath them. Panic shouted again. Desperate, fleeing panic. But there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned their PA on again, and it said, "There's no point in acting all surprised. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display in your local department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years. So you've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaints. And it's far too late to start making a fuss at it now." The PA fell silent again, and its echo drifted across the land. The huge ships turned slowly in the sky with easy power. On the underside of each hatchway opened an empty, black square. By this time, somebody, somewhere, must have manned a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcasted a message back to the Vogon ship to plead on behalf of the planet. Nobody had ever heard what they said. They only heard the reply. The PA slammed back into life again. The voice was a noise. "What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centauri? For heaven's sakes, mankind, it's only 4 light years away. You know, I'm sorry, but if you can't be bothered to be interested in the local affairs, that's your own lookout. Energize the demolition beams." Light poured out of the hatchways. "I don't know," said the voice on the PA. "A pathetic, bloody planet. I have no sympathy at all." It cut off. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. There was a terrible, ghastly noise. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. The Vogon construction fleet coasted away into the inky, starry void. All right, where are we at? We are on chapter 4. Looks like we've got time for at least 1 or 2 more chapters if you guys are still interested and have not fallen asleep yet. Let's see what it's going to take to get to the next chapter. Yeah, we might get 1 or 2 more chapters in. Hey, you guys asked for this, so if you're not enjoying it, that's not my fault. All right, here we go. Chapter 4. Far away on the opposite spiral arm of the galaxy, 500,000 light years from the star Sol, Zaphod Beeblebrox, president of the Imperial Galactic Government, sped across the seas of Demogron, his ion drive delta boat winking and flashing in the Demogran sun. Demogran the hot, Demogran the remote, Demogran the almost totally unheard of. Demogran, secret home of the Heart of Gold. The boat sped across the waters. It would have been some time before it reached its destination because Demogran is such an inconveniently arranged planet. It consists of nothing but middling to large desert islands, separated by very pretty but annoyingly wide stretches of ocean. The boat sped on. Because of this topographical awkwardness, the Demogran has always remained a deserted planet, This is why the Imperial Galactic Government chose Demigron for the Heart of Gold project, because it was so deserted and the Heart of Gold project was so secret. This is where it had to be. The boat zipped and skipped across the sea that lay between the main islands of the only archipelago of any useful size on the whole planet. Zaphod was on his way from that tiny spaceport on Easter Island. The name was entirely meaningless coincidence. In galactic speak, Easter means small, flat, and light brown. He was headed to the Heart of Gold Island, which, by another meaningless coincidence, was called France. One of the side effects of the work on the Heart of Gold was a whole string of pretty meaningless coincidences. But it was not in any way a coincidence that today, the day of the culmination of the project, the great day of unveiling, the day that the Heart of Gold was finally to be introduced to the marveling galaxy, was also a great day of culmination for Zaphod Beeblebrox. It was for the sake of this day that he had first decided to run for presidency, a decision that had sent shockwaves of astonishment throughout the Imperial galaxy. Zaphod Beeblebrox, president? Not the Zaphod Beeblebrox, not the president. Many had seen it as clinching proof that the whole of the known creation had finally gone bananas. Zaphod Beeblebrox grinned and gave the boat an extra kick of speed. Zaphod Beeblebrox, adventurer, ex-hippie, good timer, crook, quite possibly, manic, self-publicist, terribly bad at personal relationships, often thought to be completely out to lunch. President? No one had gone bananas, not in that way at least. Only 6 people in the entire galaxy understood the principles on which the galaxy was governed, and they knew that once Zaphod Beeblebrox had announced his intention to run as president, it was more or less a fait accompli. He was the ideal presidency fodder. What they completely failed to understand was why Zaphod was doing it. He banked sharply, shooting a wild wall of water at the sun. Today was the day. Today was the day when they would realize what Zaphod had been up to. Today was what Zaphod Beeblebrox's presidency was all about. Today was also his 200th birthday. But that was just another meaningless coincidence. As he skipped his boat across the seas of the Demigron, he smiled quietly to himself about what a wonderful, exciting day it was going to be. He was relaxed and spread his arms lazily along the seat back. He steered with an extra arm he'd recently just fitted beneath his right one to help improve his ski boxing. "Hey," he cooed to himself, "you're a real cool boy." But his nerves sang a song shriller than a dog whistle. The island of France was about 20 miles long, 5 miles across the middle, and sadly crescent-shaped. In fact, it seemed to exist not so much as an island on its own right, as simply a means of defining the sweeping curve of a huge bay. This impression was heightened by the fact that the inner coastline of the crescent consisted almost entirely of a steep cliff. From the top of the cliff, the land sloped slowly down 5 miles to the opposite shore. On top of the cliff stood a reception committee. It consisted in large part of the engineers and researchers who had built the Heart of Gold. Mostly humanoid, but here and there were a few reptiloids, auto miners, 2 or 3 green sylph-like maximegaliticians. That's a big word there. An octopod, a physiostructuralist or 2, and a huluvu. By the way, a huluvu is a super intelligent shade of the color of blue. All, except the huluvu, were resplendent in their multicolored ceremonial lab coats. The huluvu had been temporarily refactored into a freestanding prism for the occasion. There was a mood of immense excitement thrilling through all of them. Together and between them, they had gone to and beyond the furthest limits of physical laws, restructured the fundamental fabric of matter, strained, twisted, and broke the laws of possibilities and impossibilities. But still, the greatest excitement of all seemed to be to meet the man with the orange sash around his neck. An orange sash, by the way, was what the president of the galaxy traditionally wore. It might not have been made that much difference in the galaxy, actually. None at all. Only 6 people in the galaxy knew that the job of the galactic president was not to wield power, but to attract attention away from it. Zaphod Beeblebrox was amazingly good at his job. The crowd gasped, dazzled by the sun and seamanship, as the presidential speedboat zipped around the headland into the bay. It flashed and shone as it came skating over the sea in wide skidding circles. In fact, it didn't need to touch the water at all, because it was supported on a hazy cushion of ionized atoms. But just for the effect, it was fitted with thin fin blades, which could be lowered into the water. They slashed sheets of water hissing into the air, carving deep gashes in the sea, which swayed crazily and sank back, foaming into the boat's weight as it careened across the bay. Zaphod loved the effect. It was what he was best at. He twisted the wheel sharply. The boat skidded around in a wild, sighting skid beneath the cliff face and dropped to rest slightly on the rocking waves. Within seconds, he ran onto the deck and waved and grinned over 3 billion people. The 3 billion people weren't actually there, but they were watching his every gesture through the eyes of a small robot tri-D camera, which hovered obsequiously in the air nearby. The antics of the president was always amazing, popular tri-D. That's what they were there for. He grinned again. 3,000,000,006 people didn't know it, but today was a bigger antic than anyone had bargained for. The robot camera homed in for a close-up on the more popular of his 2 heads and waved again. And he waved again. He was roughly humanoid in appearance, except for the extra head and the 3rd arm. His fair, tousled hair stuck out in random directions. His blue eyes glinted with something completely unidentifiable, and his chins were almost always unshaven. A 20-foot high transparent globe floated next to his boat, rolling and bobbing, glistening in the brilliant sun. Inside it floated a wide semicircle sofa, upholstered in glorious red leather. The more the globe bobbed and rolled, the more the sofa stayed perfectly still, steady as an unupholstered rock. Again, all done for the effect as much as anything. Zaphod stepped through the wall of the globe and relaxed on the sofa. He spread his 2 arms along the back and with the 3rd brushed some of the dust off his knee. His head looked about, smiling. He put his feet up. At any moment, he thought, he might scream. Water boiled up beneath the bubble. It seethed and spouted. The bubble surged into the air, bobbing and rolling on the waterspout. Up it climbed through the stilts of the light at the cliff. Up it surged on a jet, the water falling from beneath it, crashing back into the sea hundreds of feet below. Zaphod smiled, picturing himself. A thoroughly ridiculous form of transport, but a thoroughly beautiful one. At the top of the cliff, the globe wavered for a moment, tipped onto a railed ramp, rolling down to a small concave platform, rolled, and then came to a halt. To tremendous applause, Zaphod Beeblebrox stepped out of the bubble, his orange sash blazing in the light. The president of the galaxy had arrived. He waited for the applause to die down, then raised one hand in greeting. "Hi," he said. A government spider sidled up next to him and attempted to press a copy of his prepared speech into his hand. Pages 3 to 7 of the original version were at the moment floating soggily on the Demigron Sea, some 5 miles out from the bay. Pages 1 and 2 had been salvaged by a Demigron frond, crested eagle, and had already become incorporated into an extraordinary new form of nest, which the eagle had invented. It was constructed largely of paper mache, and it was virtually impossible for a newly hatched baby eagle egg to break out of it. The Demigron frond crested eagle had heard of the notion of survival of the species, but wanted no truck with it. Zaphod Beeblebrox would not be needing his set speech. He gently deflected the one being offered to him by the spider. "Hi," he said again. Everyone beamed at him, or at least nearly everyone. He singled out Trillian from the crowd. Trillian was a girl that Zaphod had picked up recently while visiting a planet. Just for fun, incognito. She was slim, darkish, humanoid, and with long waves of black hair, a full mouth, an odd little knob of a nose, and ridiculously brown eyes. With her red head scarf knotted in that particular way and her long, flowing, silky brown dress, she looked vaguely Arabic. Not that anyone here had ever heard of Arab. Of course, the Arabs had very recently ceased to exist. And even when they had existed, they were 500,000 light years from Demigron. Trillian wasn't anybody in particular, or so Zaphod had claimed. She just went around with him rather a lot and told him what she thought of him. "Hi, honey," he said to her. She flashed him a quick, tight little smile and looked away. And then she looked back for a moment, smiled more warmly, but by this time, he was looking somewhere else. "Hi," he said to the small knot of creatures from the press who were standing nearby, wishing that he would stop saying hi and get on with the quotes. He grinned at them particularly because he knew that in a few moments, he would be giving them one hell of a quote. The next thing he said, though, was not a lot of use to them. One of the officials of the party had irritably decided that the president was clearly not in the mood to read the delicious turned speech that he had prepared and written for him, and had flipped the switch on the remote-controlled device in his pocket. Away in front of them, a huge white dome that bulged against the sky cracked down the middle, split, and slowly folded itself down to the ground. Everyone gasped. They had known perfectly well it was going to do that because they had built it that way. Beneath it lay uncovered a huge starship, 150 meters long, shaped like a sleek running shoe. Perfectly white, mind-bogglingly beautiful. At the heart of it, unseen, lay a small gold box, which carried within it the most brain-wrenching device ever conceived. A device that made this starship unique in the history of the galaxy. A device which, after all, the ship had been named for. The Heart of Gold. "Wow," said Zaphod Beeblebrox to the Heart of Gold. There wasn't much else he could say. He said it again because he knew it would annoy the press. "Wow!" The crowd turned their faces back to look at him expectantly. He winked at Trillian, who raised her eyebrows, widened her eyes at him. She knew what he was about to say and thought him a terrible, terrible show-off. "That's really amazing," he said. That really is truly amazing. That is so amazingly amazing. I think I'd like to steal it. A marvelous presidential quote, absolutely true to form. The crowd laughed appreciative. The newsmen gleefully punched buttons on their sub-Ethan newsomatics, and the president grinned. As he grinned, his heart screamed unbearably, and he fingered the small paralysmomatic bomb that nestled quietly in his pocket. Finally, he could bear it no more. He lifted his head to the sky, let out a wild whoop in major thirds, threw the bomb to the ground, and ran forward through the sea of suddenly frozen, beaming smiles. Oh. All right. Stretch if you need to. Get that drink if you want it. I'm going to get one right before we start chapter 5. I think this is going to be our last chapter for this evening. But that's good, because it should end at a nice point where for some really interesting effects. Good cliffhanger. Okay. Chapter 5. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was not a pleasant sight. Even for other Vogons, his highly domed nose rose high above a small, piggy forehead. His dark green rubbery skin was thick enough for him to play the games of the Vogon civil service politics, and play it well, and waterproof enough for him to survive indefinitely at sea depths of down to 1,000 feet with no ill effects. Not that he'd ever went swimming, of course. His busy schedule would not allow it. He was the way he was because billions of years ago, when the Vogons had first crawled out of the sluggish primeval seas of the Vogsphere, he had lain panting and heaving on the planet's virgin shores. When the first rays of the bright young Vogsol sun had shone across them that morning, it was as if the forces of evolution had simply given up on them. There and then it had turned aside in disgust and written them off as an ugly and unfortunate mistake. They never evolved again. They should never have survived. The fact that they did is some kind of tribute to the thick-willed, slug-brained stubbornness of those creatures. Evolution? Ha! They said to themselves, who needs it? And what nature refused to do for them, they simply did without, until such time as they were able to rectify the gross anatomically inconveniences with surgery. Meanwhile, the natural forces on the planet Vogsphere had been working overtime to make up for their earlier blunder. They brought forth scintillating jeweled scuttle crabs, which the Vogons ate, smashed their shells with iron mallets, tall, aspiring trees of breathtaking slenderness and color which the Vogons cut down and burned the crab meat with, elegant gazelle-like creatures with silken coats and dewy eyes which the Vogons would snatch and sit on. They were no use as transport because their backs would snap instantly, but the Vogons sat on them instantly, and sat on them anyways. Thus the planet Vogsphere whiled away the unhappy millennia until the Vogons suddenly discovered the principles of interstellar travel. Within a few short Vog years, every last Vogon had migrated to the Megabrantis cluster, the political hub of the galaxy, and now formed the immensely powerful backbone of the galactic civil service. They had attempted to acquire learning that they have acquired learning. They have attempted to acquire style and social graces, but in most respects, the modern Vogon is little different from his primitive forebears. Every year, they import 27,000 scintillating jeweled scuttle crabs from their native home planet and while away a happy drunken night smashing them into bits with iron mallets. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was a fairly typical Vogon in that he was thoroughly vile. Also, he did not like hitchhikers. Somewhere in a small, dark cabin, buried deep in the intestines of Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz's flagship, a small match flared nervously. The owner of the match was not a Vogon, but he knew all about them and was right to be nervous. His name was Ford Prefect. He looked about the cabin and could see very little. Strange, monstrous shadows loomed and leapt with the tiny flickering flame, but all was quiet. He breathed a silent thank you to the Dentrasi. The Dentrasi are an unruly tribe of Gormans, a wild but pleasant bunch whom the Vogons had recently taken to employing as catering staff on their long-haul fleets, on the strict understanding that they kept very much to themselves. This suited the Dentrasi fine because they loved Vogon money, which is one of the hardiest currencies in space, but loathed the Vogons themselves. The only sort of Vogon a Dentrasi liked to see was an annoyed Vogon. And it was because of this tiny piece of information that Ford Prefect was not now a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. He heard a slight groan. By the light of the match, he saw a heavy shape moving slightly on the floor. Quickly, he shook the match out, reached into his pocket, found what he was looking for, and took it out. He ripped it open and shook it. Crouched on the floor, the shape moved again. Ford Prefect said, "I brought some peanuts." Arthur Dent moved and groaned again, muttered incoherently. "Here, have some," urged Ford, shaking the packet again. "If you've never been through a matter transference beam before, you've probably lost some salt and protein. The beer you had should have helped cushion your system just a little bit." Said Arthur Dent. He opened his eyes. "It's dark," he said. "Yes," said Ford Prefect. "It's dark." "No light," said Arthur Dent. "Dark, no light." One of the things Ford Prefect had always found hardest to understand about humans was their habit of continually stating and repeating the very, very obvious. As in, "It's a nice day," or "You're very tall," or "Oh dear, you seem to have fallen down a 30-foot well. Are you all right?" At first, Ford had formed a theory to account for this strange behavior. If human beings don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their mouths would probably seize up. After a few months' consideration and observation, he abandoned this theory in favor of a new one. If they don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their brains start working. After a while, he abandoned this one as well as being obstructively cynical and decided he quite liked human beings after all, but he always remained desperately worried about the terrible number of things they didn't know about. Yes, he agreed with Arthur. "No lights." He helped Arthur to some peanuts. "How do you feel?" he asked him. "Like a military academy," said Arthur. "Bits of me keep passing out." Ford stared at him blankly in the darkness. "If I were asked where the hell we were, would I regret it?" Ford stood up. "We're safe," he said. "Oh, good," said Arthur. "We're in a small gallery cabin," said Ford, "in one of the spaceships of the Vogon construction fleet." "Ah," said Arthur. "This is obviously some strange usage of the word safe that I was unaware of." Ford struck another match to help him search for the light switch. Monstrous shadows leapt and loomed. Arthur struggled to his feet and hugged himself apprehensively. Hideous alien shapes seemed to throng about him. The air was thick with musty smells which sidled up into his lungs without identifying themselves, and a low, irritating hum kept his brain from focusing. How did we get here? He said, shivering slightly. We hitched a lift, said Ford. Excuse me, said Arthur. Are you trying to tell me that we just stuck out our thumb and some bug-eyed monster stuck out his head and said, "Hi, fellas, hop right in. I can take you as far as Basingstoke roundabout"? Well, said Ford, the thumb's an electronic sub-ether signaling device, and the roundabout's at Bernard's Star 6 light years away. But otherwise, yeah, that's more or less right. And the bug-eyed monster is green, yes. Fine, said Arthur. When can we go home? You can't, said Ford Prefect, and found the light switch. Shade your eyes, he said, and turned it on. Even Ford was surprised. Good grief, said Arthur. Is this really the interior of a flying saucer? Prosnetnik Vogon Jeltz heaved his unpleasant green body around the control bridge. He always felt vaguely irritable after demolishing a populated planet. He wished that someone would come and tell him that it was all wrong to do that and he could shout at them and feel better. He flopped as heavily as he could onto his control seat in the hope that it would break and give him something to be genuinely angry about, but it only gave a complaining sort of creak. Go away, he shouted at a young Vogon guard who'd entered the bridge at that moment. The guard vanished immediately, feeling rather relieved. He was glad it wouldn't now be him who had to deliver the report that they'd just received. The report was an official release which said that a wonderful new form of spaceship drive was at this moment being unveiled at the government research base on Demogron, which would henceforth make all hyperspatial express routes unnecessary. Another door slid open, but this time the Vogon captain didn't shout, because it was the door from the gallery quarters where Dentrossi prepared his meal. A meal would be most welcomed. A huge, furry creature bounded through the door with his lunch tray. It was grinning like a maniac. Prosnetnik Vogon Jeltz was delighted. He knew that when a Dentrossi looked that pleased with himself, there was something going on somewhere on the ship that he could get very angry indeed about. Ford and Arthur stared around them. Well, what do you think? Said Ford. It's a bit squalid, isn't it? Ford frowned at the grubby mattress, unwashed cups, and unidentifiable bits of smelly alien underwear that lay around the cramped cabin. Well, this is a working ship, you see, and these are the Dentrossi sleeping quarters. I thought you said they were called Vogons or something. Yes, said Ford. The Vogons run the ship. The Dentrossis are the cook, and they let us aboard. I'm confused, said Arthur. Here, have a look at this, said Ford. He sat down on one of the mattresses and rummaged about his satchel. Arthur prodded the mattress nervously and then sat on it himself. In fact, he had very little to be nervous about because all mattresses grown in the swamps of Scorncellis Zeta were very thoroughly killed and dried before being put into service. Very few have ever come to life again. Ford handed the book to Arthur. What is this? Said Arthur. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a sort of electronic book. It tells you everything you need to know about anything. That's its job. Arthur turned it over nervously in his hand. I like the cover, he said. Don't panic. It's the first helpful, intelligent thing anybody has said to me all day. I'll show you how it works, said Ford. He snatched it from Arthur, who was still holding it as if it were a 2-week dead lark, and pulled it out of its cover. You press this button here, you see, and the screen lights up and gives you an index. A screen about 3 inches by 4, lit up and characters began to flicker across the surface. You want to know about the Vogons, so I entered the name, so... And his fingers tapped some more on the keys, and there we are. The words Vogon Constructor Fleet flared in the green across the screen. Ford pressed a large red button at the bottom of the screen, and the words began to undulate across it. At the same time, the book began to speak the entry as well in the still quiet, began to speak the entry in a still quiet, measured voice. This is what the book said. Vogon Construction Fleet. Here's what to do if you want to get a lift from a Vogon Construction Fleet. Forget it. They are one of the most unpleasant races in the galaxy. Not actually evil, but bad-tempered, bureaucratic, officious, and callous. They wouldn't even lift a finger to save their own grandmothers from the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Trowel without orders signed in triplicate, sent in, sent back, queried, lost, found, subjected to public inquiry, lost again, and finally buried in soft peat for 3 months and recycled as firelighter. The best way to get a drink out of a Vogon is to stick your finger down its throat. And the best way to irritate him is to feed his grandmother to the ravenous bug-batter beast of Trowel. On no account allow a Vogon to read poetry at you. Arthur blinked. What a strange book. How did we get a lift then? That's the point. It's out of date now, said Ford, sliding the book back into its cover. I'm doing the field research for the new revised edition, and one of the things I'll have to do is include a bit about how the Vogons now employ the Dentrossi cooks, which gives us a rather useful little loophole. A pained expression crossed Arthur's face. But who are the Dentrossi, he said. Great guys, said Ford. They're the best cooks and the best drink mixers, and they don't give a wet slap about anything else. And they'll always help hitchhikers board, partly because they like the company, but mostly because it annoys the Vogons. Which is exactly the sort of thing you need to know if you're an impoverished hitchhiker trying to see the marvels of the universe for less than $30 Altarian a day. That's my job. Fun, isn't it? Arthur looked lost. It's amazing, he said, and frowned at one of the other mattresses. Unfortunately, I got stuck on Earth rather longer than I had intended, said Ford. I came for a week and got stuck for 15. But how did you get here in the first place then? Easy. I got a lift from a teaser. A teaser? Yeah. What is a teaser? Teasers are usually rich kids with nothing to do. They cruise around looking for planets they haven't made interstellar contact with yet, and they buzz them. Buzz them? Arthur began to feel that Ford was really enjoying making life difficult for him. Yeah, said Ford. They buzz them. They find some isolated spot with very few people around, then they land right by some poor unsuspecting soul whom no one's ever going to believe them, and then strut up and down in front of them wearing silly antennas on their head, making beep, beep, beep noises, rather childish, really. Ford leaned back on the mattress with his hands behind his head and looked infuriatingly pleased with himself. Ford, said Arthur, I don't know if this sounds like a silly question, but what am I doing here? Well, you know that I rescued you from Earth. And what's happened to Earth? Ah, it's been demolished. Has it? Said Arthur levelly. Yep, it just boiled away into space. Look, said Arthur, I'm a bit upset about this. Ford frowned to himself and seemed to roll the thought around in his head. Yeah, I guess I can understand that. Understand that? Shouted Arthur. Understand that? Ford sprang up. Keep looking at the book, he hissed urgency. What? Don't panic. I'm not panicking. Yes, you are. All right, so I'm panicking. What else is there to do?
You just come along with me and have a good time. The galaxy's a fun place. You'll need to have this fish in your ear."
"I beg your pardon?"
asked Arthur rather politely, he thought. Ford was holding up a glass jar, which quite clearly had a small yellow fish wriggling around in it. Arthur blinked at him. He wished there was something simple and recognizable he could grasp a hold of. He would have felt safe if alongside of Jendrassi's underwear, the piles of squirrelish mattresses, and the man from Beetlejuice holding a small yellow fish and offering to put it in his ear, he had been able to see just a small packet of cornflakes. But he couldn't. He didn't feel safe. Suddenly, a violent noise leapt at them from no source that he could identify. He gasped in horror at the sounds of a man trying to gargle while fighting off a pack of wolves. "Shush," said Ford. "Listen, it might be important."
Important?
"It's the Vogon captain making an announcement on the tannoy."
"You mean that's how the Vogons talk?"
"Listen."
"But I can't speak Vogon."
"You don't need to. Just put this fish in your ear." Ford, with lightning movements, clapped his hand to the side of Arthur's ear. He had the sudden sickening sensation of a fish slithering deep into his aerial track. Gasping with horror, he scrambled at his ears for a second or so, but then slowly turned goggle-eyed with wonder. He was experiencing the aerial equivalent of looking at a picture of two black silhouetted faces and suddenly seeing it as a picture of a white candlestick, or of looking at a lot of colored dots on a piece of paper which suddenly resolved themselves into the figure 6 and mean that your optician is going to charge you a lot of money for a new pair of glasses. He was still listening to the howling gargles. He knew that, only now it had somehow taken on the semblance of perfect, straightforward English. This is what it said. And that is the end of chapter 5, and that leaves us with chapter 6 as the next chapter, but that is going to have to be for another time. I hope you all had as much fun as I did and enjoyed every little bit of it. I hope it was a nice, quiet, relaxing way to end your Sundays. But this is where we are going to part ways for tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure and fun. I am going to send you guys, because there's not really anywhere to send you guys after a particular stream of this nature. So we're going to go and say hi to... we haven't raided DM Cerberus in a while. And looks like he's currently doing some Valheim right now. So I say we go say hi to Mr. Cerberus and catch up with him. I've had an absolute pleasant time. I hope you guys have enjoyed it yourself. And I will look forward to seeing you all next time. But for right now, don't go anywhere. And we will raid out. Before we do that, we'll just raid out. It'll be fine. All right.
And kick this raid off. As always, a pleasure. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for the 2 raids from Pirate Boy and Resilient Gamer. Thank you, Kat, for coming in with the resub. Thank you all for the hanging out and listening. I hope you have enjoyed yourself, and we will see you guys next time. I have put a change of schedule up, so you'll want to check out the new schedule. We're doing a slight shift in things, so I think we've moved to a Monday, Wednesday, Saturday starting now. So I will see you guys tomorrow. Until then, be safe, have fun, enjoy the rest of your weekends. And until the next time, bye.